Alright, today we have a fun one. We are taking a look at a Naya Zoo list, which caught my eye when looking through the 5.0 lists that Wizards of the Coast put up on their site. And this deck has some unique inclusions and some unique omissions that I knew I just had to check out to figure out what was going on. Before we dive into the deck though, just want to quickly point out, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, now would be a great time to do so. Subscribing to the channel is a free and easy way to support the growth here. We're looking to expand and do partnerships with other groups, and increasing my subscriber count is a great way for me to do that. Also consider following the channel on Twitch. We have a new stream schedule, which is Saturdays at 7 a.m. and Mondays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. And of course, if you can't catch the stream, you can always see the replays right here on the YouTube channel. Alright, so this is the exact 75 cards that 5.0'd a competitive league by the player HIERARCH. And this list has actually showed up by this player before, so it's not a just one-off fluke that this player did very well. I've seen this player in this list show up in several of the 5.0 finishes that Wizards has posted. At 1 mana, you have some unusual inclusions in the fact that you have 4 Noble Hierarchs and 1 Birds of Paradise. It's possible that I just haven't played Zoo in a long time and things have changed, but most Zoo decks are low to the ground enough that you don't really need all these ramped creatures. The Exalted from Noble Hierarch I think is very, very good, but the inclusion of the 5th mana creature in the form of Birds of Paradise is a bit strange. But all this leads up to a curve that's just a little bit top heavier, since you are running a 5-drop main deck and you have some other high mana cost cards in your sideboard. The rest of the 1-drops are a pretty obvious inclusion. With 4 Wild Nacatl as your premier beater, just a 3/3 body on 1 mana is very, very powerful. You have 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. You obviously want to max out on this, as it's both removal and a way to close out the game as the board gets bogged up. And 3 copies of Path to Exile, which is a clear inclusion to keep the board free of big creatures so you can continue to hit in. At 2 mana, we see the absence of Modern's premier 2-drop beater, Tarmogoyf. It's possible that Tarmogoyf was omitted as a budget consideration, but I think that the cards that are here are a really, really good choice for the metagame. By getting rid of Tarmogoyf, you get to have 3 Voice of Resurgence, and Voice is very powerful with the increased number of control decks there are to battle all of the linear creature strategies in Modern. You also can fit 2 copies of Scavenging OOZE, which are good against graveyard strategies like Mardu Pyromancer or Hollow One, and you can also fit in 2 copies of CASALI PRIDEMAGE. Despite this deck running 4 basics and a bunch of mana creatures, I have found that this deck can be a little susceptible to Blood Moon, so it's nice to have Blood Moon hate in the main deck in the form of CASALI PRIDEMAGE. As additional enchantment hate, you also have DROMOKA'S command in the main deck, which is a bit of an unusual inclusion. I do like it though as a removal spell that can also make your team a little bit bigger afterwards. Getting rid of an opposing creature all while giving your creature a counter to increase your clock is exactly the sort of thing this deck wants to do. The last 2-drop is a single copy of Lightning Helix. It just seems like Lightning Bolt number 5, and it gains you a little bit of life, which is pretty good since every life point really matters in a deck like this. At 3 mana, we have the obvious inclusions of Knight of the Reliquary and Loxodon Smiter. These are just powerful beaters. You're not doing a lot of land shenanigans with Knight of the Reliquary like you might do in a green-white company deck, but Knight can get very big very fast, and spending 3 mana to have a 6/6 creature is just exactly what this deck wants to do. The only cards you really want to fetch up with Knight is you have a single copy of Ghost Quarter to deal with an opposing land that's giving you trouble, and a single copy of Kessig Wolfront, which is really good for pushing through damage. There's a bit of innovation here at 3 with a copy of THALIA, HERETIC, CATHAR. 3/2 first strike on a 3 mana body is a little below rate, but what makes the card so good in this deck is it makes your creatures that your opponents play come into play tapped, making it harder for them to block your onslaught of massive creatures. Also, by causing their non-basic lands to enter the battlefield tapped, you can really slow down their development as well. Thalia, Heretic, Cathar is especially good against fetch lands, which come into play tapped, and then on your opponent's next turn, they have to fetch a basic in order to ensure they actually can use the mana next turn. Otherwise, that's 2 turns that land won't be producing them any mana. Domri Rade is the last 3-drop in this deck, and it's also an unusual one. Domri Rade's +1 allows you to look at the top card of your library, and if it's a creature, put it in your hand. Since the deck has a high density of creatures, this should have a pretty good shot at finding one, but you shouldn't rely on this as a value engine, as it's only going to be draw a card about 40% of the time. His -2 I think is what is really good, because it allows you to potentially remove an opposing threat while still developing your board. So you can use your creature to fight another creature, killing it, And you should be able to do this since most of your creatures will be bigger than your opponent's average creature. And then that leaves you a Domri Rade at 1 loyalty that your opponent has to spend resources to get rid of, otherwise you can potentially get value off of his +1. At 4 mana, there is a lot to talk about. The giant question I have to ask at 4 mana is, where are the Bloodbraid Elves? Since the card's unbanning, this seems like the perfect deck for this card to shine. It's a hasty threat, it gets you an additional card. The only real awkward hits are one of the 3 Path to Exiles. But I just have to trust that the deck creator knows best and chose to leave them out for a good reason. I just don't know what they are. So one of the first things that caught my eye are these 3 flip cards on 4. You have 2 copies of Huntmaster the Fells, which is a card I absolutely adore. I have great memories of playing this card when it was standard legal, and I think it's a really good card that's just been edged out of modern as cards have gotten more and more powerful. If you haven't had a chance to play for this card, Huntmaster the Fells is a pretty innocuous 4-drop that when it comes into play, it's just a 2/2 that makes another 2/2 and gets you 2 life. So not a very good rate on a 4-drop creature as far as modern is concerned. The power of Huntmaster comes from when you don't cast any spells. If no spells are cast in a turn, it flips on the following turn, turning Huntmaster into a 4/4, which deals 2 damage to your opponent and 2 damage to a creature your opponent controls. And of course, once Huntmaster is flipped, if 2 spells are ever cast in a single turn, it'll flip back to its original form on that next turn, gaining 2 more life and making another 2/2 green wolf token. Now, Huntmaster has always been on that fringe of modern playable, but the other card that shows up on the 4-drop slot that's unusual is Arlinn Kord, which I have never seen in any sort of modern deck before. In fact, Arlinn Kord wasn't really a standard all-star when it came out. Arlinn starts at 3 loyalty, and her best ability is her 0, so she is very vulnerable to Lightning Bolt. But this is a good deck for using her +1. +2/+2 in Vigilance, I think, is actually a really, really powerful ability in this meta. Giving one of your 3-drops or 2-drops power and Vigilance allows you to continue to beat in on your opponent, but still have a blocker, which is very powerful in this creature-heavy meta. There's a lot of decks like Humans, or Eldrazi Death and Taxes, or Hollow One, where the board can get gummed up with creatures, and you really want to pressure them, but at the same time, you don't want to tap your creatures so that way they can pressure you back. So Arlinn is a really interesting way that allows you to do that. The flip side of Arlinn Kord, which she flips once you use her 0 ability to make a wolf, is a little less powerful in this deck. Her -1 to deal 3 damage to any target is obviously good for removal. It's just you'd have to flip her and then have it survive to be able to use that -1 the next turn. And her +1, it's +1/+1 and trample across all your creatures, which is good if you can manage to have quite a few of them out, and the trample's good if you're dealing with something like Marduk Pyromancer that's going to create a lot of tokens and chump blockers. The other card in the 4-drop slot that's unusual is Elspeth Knight-Errant. This is the original iteration of Elspeth, and it's unusual to see it here when so many other 4-mana planeswalkers have been printed that could possibly do her job a little bit better. She can tick up to create a guy, which is good. It's always nice when a planeswalker can increase its loyalty count and protect itself all in one go. And her +1 to give a creature +3/+3 in flying is really good in a deck like this that helps you punch through damage in the air if the board has been gummed up because you're playing against another creature-based deck. In a deck like this, where you have powerful creatures with huge stats like Loxodon Smiter, Knight of the Reliquary, Wild Nacatl, and Elspeth's ability to force your creatures through is probably what gives her the nod over other 4-drop planeswalkers that you might include at this slot, like Gideon Ally of Zendikar or Ajani Vengeance. And finally, at the top of the curve, we have Lyra Dawnbringer. Now, Lyra is very similar to Baneslayer Angel in this deck. Baneslayer has protection from dragons and from demons, which is hardly relevant when you consider there are not a lot of dragons and not a lot of demons being played in Modern. The additional piece of text that Lyra has instead, giving other angels +1/+1 and lifelink, isn't relevant in the main deck, but in the sideboard you have 1 copy of Sigarda, Host of Herons, and 1 copy of Shalai, Voice of Plenty. And if you manage to resolve one of them and Lyra, you can get some value that way. The sideboard seems like it makes a lot of sense. You have Shalai, Voice of Plenty as a way to give you hexproof in matchups where you need that. You have TOCATLI Honor Guard against decks that have a lot of enters the battlefield effect creatures. You have a Thalia, Guardian of Thraben against spell-heavy decks. You have 2 Stony Silence against Affinity. 1 Blessed Alliance as additional removal. An Ancient Grudge as additional artifact hate. Basically, if I'm ever playing a deck with green and red, it's very hard not to fit at least one Ancient Grudge into the sideboard. You have a copy of Crumble to Dust to help against Tron. You have a single Bonfire of the Damned to help against creature decks. One Choke to fight against blue decks. A Thrun, which is a very, very powerful card that many control decks can't deal with. Since Jeskai control heavily relies on Supreme Verdict as their Wrath of choice instead of Wrath of God, it's going to be very difficult for that deck to beat him. You have a Gaddock Teague for decks that have a lot of high cost spells. A Sigarda, and this is really, really powerful against something like Jund. Most Jund decks do not have any way to deal with it since they cannot target to get rid of it, and they can't make you sack it with something like Liliana of the Veil. And finally, 2 Damping Sphere. This is good against Tron, and this is also good against Storm. Well, that's it for the deck tech. I'm very excited about this deck. I have taken it through some matches in Magic Online, and I've been very impressed with how well it performs. So I'm excited to stream with this deck. And again, my stream schedule is Mondays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. and Saturdays at 7 a.m. So if you want to see me stream this, tune in at one of those times. If you have anything you want to say or see changed in the deck, let me know in the comments below. And I hope to see you on the Twitch stream.